I'm Lynn Clancher. I'm a nurse at the VA hospital here in Richmond, Hunter Holmes McGuire VA Medical Center. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Paul Short. He's a neuropsychologist that specializes in work with individuals and families that are touched by movement disorders. Dr. Short has a doctorate in clinical psychology from Texas A&M University. He completed fellowships with the Maryland VA Medical Center, I believe in Baltimore, and also the University of Maryland Medical School Department of Neurology. Dr. Short calls himself the Parkinson's coach, and in his private practice, he works with families to translate his understanding of neurocognitive processes into management strategies and helping people with family, life, relationship issues, and other challenges that people with Parkinson's face. Dr. Short also writes 2 blogs. We talked a lot about social media this morning. 2 blogs. One is for the American Parkinson's Disease Association, and that's called The Uniquely Young Onset. And then he has a blog on his Parkinson Coach website, and that's www.theparkinsonscoach.com. He also has a Twitter feed, and it's pound, is that how it goes? Pound PD, hashtag PD Psych. So you'll see that on his slides. Please welcome Dr. Short.
Can everybody hear me? Okay. This is a live mic now? Okay. Okay, great. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for being here. My name is Dr. Paul. I'm the guy that gets to talk to everybody that's going to fall asleep after lunch, so I'm obligated to be as interesting as I can. We'll see how that works. Is anybody in here caffeinated after lunch? Oh boy. Okay. All right. I was really pleased to come to Richmond because this is actually one of my favorite cities. I'm an amateur historian, and my intent was after today to stay over, and I was going to go down to Petersburg and kind of work my way around the circle. That's all closed, so I thought, okay, what the heck, I'll go to Hollywood Cemetery today and look at all the Confederates that are there. Got a rainstorm, so I don't know. What are you folks doing here? I want to touch, one of the reasons I like coming later, being one of the later speakers, is I can follow on to some of the points other people have made. I bring a PowerPoint, and I want you to understand what a PowerPoint is. This is my understanding of it, and I learned this when I was in graduate school. PowerPoints are designed to keep you on task. And I learned this during my defense because someone would ask me a question. I've got 5 experts in the field standing there or sitting around asking me questions to trip me up and embarrass me. And with the PowerPoint, I can always say, there'll be a slide coming up that will address that. So it will keep, it tends to keep audiences on course. I tend not to stay on course. So I don't know what slide's going to come up and what I'll be saying at that given time, but I've got some pertinent points that I'm going to try to make. Also want to follow up something that Julie said. The question of young or older I have a problem with the term young onset because that implies that the other one is, what, traditional onset, old onset? I mean, there's no good term for the other side. So I try to avoid using that terminology. And honestly, a lot of the difference is really the stage of life that you're in. That's what Julie touched on. If you're trying to put kids through college, you're trying to save up for your retirement, and Parkinson's rears its ugly head, that's a big change, that's a big difference that you have to deal with as someone who's had most of their life accomplishments completed and behind them has to deal with. So I think it's more of a life, stage of life thing than an actual some line of demarcation. So I'll just roughly define young onset as anybody that's been born since, what, should we say the Second World War? Okay, all right. If you know what Parkland means today, there's that movie that's coming out this weekend. If you know what Parkland means, you're still young enough to be a young onset person. And if you remember where you were when Kennedy was shot, that's one better. So, okay, the task. What I'm going to talk about. A lot of times when you're getting education about Parkinson's disease, you get information, a lot of medically oriented information, and frequently the topic of dementia comes up. And dementia is one possible outcome of Parkinson's, but it's not necessarily something that everybody's going to experience. But there are some other changes that occur with Parkinson's, fairly predictable changes. And what we want to do today is talk about a few of those things. And I'll just start here. First of all, I want to tell you, I like to translate science into English. So there will be no synapses harmed today. You're not going to see any synapses on. You're not going to see dopamine going across the synaptic junction. You're not going to see a brain slide. Part of the reason is that Janet actually showed a slide that I would have shown because it's going to show you the parts of the brain that I'm dealing with. So I didn't have a slide in there, but you know how these things work out. All right, what is Parkinson's disease? Well, these are some symptoms: depression and or anxiety disorder, REM sleep behavior disorder. This is when you wrestle with demons while you're asleep and sometimes lash out, sometimes talk in your sleep. And this precedes the thing I'm going to talk about a little bit by many years. Dysautonomia. You have difficulty with your autonomic nervous system, adjusting to things like standing up quickly, temperature difficulties, just a whole host of really aggravating things. Anosmia. How many people knew with Parkinson's that you might lose your sense of smell? Boy, that was one they snuck in on you. Sexual dysfunction. We had someone today mention constipation. That's always a biggie for folks with Parkinson's. Neurogenic bladders. And finally, changes in cognition, including dementia. Of all those symptoms, what's missing? Yeah, I didn't put any of that motor stuff up there. There's a reason why. Parkinson's disease is not just a movement disorder. The first time you get the diagnosis, you go to a movement disorder center and somebody who is trained in movement disorders will diagnose you. But it is not a movement disorder. It's more than that. It's a movement disorder with some other things that I just read you. When I first started doing this work with Parkinson's, I'd see people get up, a lot of neurologists would get up and they talk about non-motor symptoms. I don't see the parenthetical part anymore. They're actually talking about the symptoms, but they're still calling them non-motor symptoms. These are symptoms of a brain disorder. You have a bona fide neurological change occurring in a specific part of your brain, and the upstream effects of it are varied. One of the constellations is going to be the motor symptoms. The other reason why we like to call it a movement disorder is because your neurologist can treat the neurological symptoms, can treat the motor symptoms. These other symptoms that I listed up there are a little bit more tricky. Part of the reason for that is you've got to send somebody to you've got to farm somebody out. It's called turfing, if you've ever heard that term, but you've got to turf somebody to a specialist in that area. And one of the specialists is actually a psychologist, because we're used to working with things like dysautonomia. We can do some things to help people with that. We can do some things to help people with depression and anxiety. I walked around all the tables today, and we didn't get any airtime. So tell all the people that put tables out to remember psychology, because we are actually a very, very important part of what goes on in treatment of Parkinson's disease. So we're dealing with a brain disorder. And if we lose sight of that, then these other symptoms just seem like aggravating things that are coming on, but they're actually a part of it. Now, the tremor, the stiffness, the motor slowing, all of those things they're the hallmark symptoms. When you see those, when the doctor sees those, he or she is going to say, aha, Parkinson's. And it's all the better if you respond to the levodopa or to whatever substance that they're going to give you to treat the disease. But don't lose sight of the fact that there are other things that go on with Parkinson's. It is more than just a movement disorder. All right, so let's get to what we're going to talk about today, the thing that everybody is either worried about or wondering what Dr. Short is going to say. We're going to talk about dementia, and then talk about what dementia is not, because most of what people with Parkinson's are going to experience occurs many years before what we would call dementia falls into place. Not everybody gets dementia, but a substantial number of people do have some of these other cognitive difficulties. The definition of dementia is actually changing a little bit. It's going to change specifically next year when we move into a different classification system, the international system that we're going to put in place that Medicare is going to use for billing, so that makes it official. Once Medicare says this is it, then this is it. So ICD-9 is going to come in next year. And interestingly, the ICD-10 is coming in. 9 made it kind of easy for us to diagnose dementia. We had some qualifications that we do, change in memory, then change in 1 or 2 other neurocognitive aspects. I'm going to go with the old school dementia examination. If I do this next year, or definition, if I do this next year, I'll come back and talk differently. But dementia typically is loss of intellectual functions like memory, learning, reasoning, problem solving, abstract thinking. You see a decline from an earlier state in life. So you think of where a person was functioning at a certain stage of their life, and you say, is this qualitatively different than who they were? And dementia is chronic and progressive. If it isn't chronic and progressive, it's a different diagnosis, because if it's not chronic and progressive, we might be able to do something about it. Right now, we don't have any medical treatments to turn the corner on dementia. So it's a given right now. Now, there's some treatments that help people manage dementia better, but we still can't cure it. And the other requirement is that it impairs vocational or social function. So this is what we call the classic dementia. And let me make a distinction that a lot of people aren't aware of. When we say dementia, the most common cause for dementia is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a dementing disease, but it is not dementia. I mean, it is dementia, but it's not the definitive thing for dementia. So when somebody says that they're dealing with dementia, they don't necessarily have Alzheimer's disease. They've got some memory problems and some other things that are occurring. Parkinson's is a little bit different. I use a comparison with Alzheimer's disease to kind of point this out. Alzheimer's disease involves the external part of your brain. That's that wrinkly thing that everybody sees and we see a brain. That's where a lot of the degeneration is occurring for Alzheimer's disease. It's in an area we call the neocortex. So it's one of the areas is the neocortex. And it typically presents with memory problems that are marked by difficulty either encoding or remembering where you left the data. So if I ask you to learn something, typically I might ask you to learn a few bits of information. Then 20 minutes later, I will surprise you and ask you if you still remember those. A person with Alzheimer's disease may not just not remember those things, but may not remember that they had been exposed to them. A person with Parkinson's disease tends to be a little bit different. If I give the same kind of information to a person with Parkinson's disease, there may be some difficulties learning it, and I'm going to talk about that because that's part of this process. But if I show them the words or show them, ask them if they've seen this or not seen this, most people with Parkinson's do quite well. They're aware that they've been exposed to the material. So basically, I guess the biggest difference is with a cortical presentation like Alzheimer's disease, you either have a hard time putting it into memory someplace or remembering where you stashed the little file folder. With Parkinson's disease, we get reasonably good encoding, but what we'll also get is some difficulty maybe remembering where we put that folder, but if I give you some cueing, you're going to find it. So when a person is having some difficulty in Parkinson's disease, a lot of times just simple cueing is a good way to help them retrieve the information. The other part of it is, let's see. I'm at that stage where I want to wear my glasses and I don't want you guys to think I'm old. Yeah, I'm among friends, right? Parkinson's disease, obviously, as many of you know, is centered in the basal ganglia. When I took my first neuroanatomy course, Nixon was president, and they talked about the basal ganglia. What I learned is this was involved in coordinated movement. People that had Parkinson's diseases had problems with that. Over the years, as we've done more research with the basal ganglia, with actually brain research, what we've learned is the basal ganglia is actually a very important junction for a lot of circuits that are involved in cognitive processing, movement being one of them. In your dog or your cat, a lot of the things that we would call thinking are occurring more at the basal ganglia level than they are at the higher cortical areas. So phylogenetically, if you go back down and look at animals, you're going to find their interaction with the world is occurring to one degree or another through the basal ganglia. What's happened with us is we've got these big brains. Our basal ganglia is plugged into the prefrontal cortex that we saw earlier tonight. You should have brought a basal ganglia for me, though. You didn't know I needed it. But what this implies is that there is actually some cognitive processing that's going on in the basal ganglia. Now, the brain functions in a very unique way. I qualified unique. I hate people doing that. It works in a unique way. Information is kind of processed in different areas. It comes back, the feedback loops upon loops, information gets processed, and then you have this product we call a thought, which tends not to happen when I'm up here. That thought is a cognitive process that's occurred through a kind of a sending of information into a lot of different areas of the brain, bringing it together, and pulling it together and saying, okay, this is a final product here. Most folks with Parkinson's, the first symptom that they're going to notice is their thinking appears to be slower. I've heard it described as thinking through molasses. Most of you probably have a very colorful definition of what it's like sometimes. One of the areas it comes up, I've got several good friends that have Parkinson's. One of them was a very humorous person. Once his Parkinson's started to go, he was still a very funny person, but he couldn't think of the funny thing until it was well past the time that it was going to be funny. So he didn't lose his sense of humor, he just lost his sense of timing. And if you've ever watched a comic that's got bad timing, so what I usually do is I cue him a little bit, and if you're going to say something funny, go ahead. I'm going to stop the conversation, and we're going to let you catch up and do this. So there's some particular things that can happen with Parkinson's that I want to talk about. Okay, so PD is typically a subcortical kind of a presentation, which means it's occurring in the inner part of your brain more than the external part of your brain. And so what we see are things like forgetfulness rather than true amnesia. And that's what I was talking about if I cue things. It just doesn't quite get in as solidly as it used to before. There can be some impairment in insight. Sometimes people can look at things and figure out how they're supposed to function. The one that a lot of folks struggle with is poor strategizing, and I'm going to talk about that. We have problems with attention and focus. Some people also have some verbal fluency problems, but that's more as we're heading in toward more presentation of dementia. And then there's depression. Before a neuropsychologist can ever really say a person's got this, or this going on with Parkinson's, first question we have to ask is that person depressed? Now, I don't know if anybody in here has experienced depression with Parkinson's disease. It doesn't run with Parkinson's, it just gallops with it. And it is not necessarily adjustment to a difficult situation. It seems to be related to some of those circuits that I was talking about. Some people get it very badly, some people don't get it much at all. There was a paper that I have not had a chance to read yet, but I just got cued on Medscape this week, that intractable depression, or very difficult to treat depression, is often a good predictor, or often one predictor of Parkinson's disease. One thing to remember too, when we talk about predictors for Parkinson's disease, a lot of these things like loss of sense of smell, depression, REM sleep behavior disorder where you're fighting, these things are not specific. They're part of that Parkinson's constellation, but if somebody has them, the doctor doesn't go, aha, there's Parkinson's coming on. So we're not at a stage where we can use those diagnostically, but when we look back, we'll see that a lot of people struggled with, very much with depression. Okay. Following on the theme of disorganization, I just messed my notes up. All right. Really, the key to what you're seeing with Parkinson's disease is a change in executive function. Now, I want to start out by saying that if I get a room full of neuropsychologists and I say define executive function, I'm going to get a room full of different answers. There is no agreed upon, except that we come up with a kind of a thing and we throw the word executive function out as if we know what we're talking about, and it's sort of like pornography. We know it when we see it, but we can't define it in any kind of way that it's useful for anybody. So executive function, according to Dr. Paul, is the cognitive process that regulates, manages, and controls other cognitive processes. The term for that we use is metacognition. We are, as far as we know, unique creatures because we're able to think about our own thinking. Now, one of the things that folks with Parkinson's notice fairly early on is that their metacognition starts to change. They're not able to monitor what they're thinking about as well as they used to. But the other, this is the primary thing, because metacognition is part of what's allowing us to act on the world. If I go into I'm a Boy Scout leader. If I go into a Boy Scout troop and tell a dirty joke, my metacognition is off. I've made a bit of a mistake there in judgment and interacting with the world. So it's part of the process that's controlling what we're doing. Now, I'm going to a little bit of a higher level than most neuropsychologists do because, to be honest with you, we don't have very many tests for metacognition. I don't think we have any, do we? Metacognition is sort of it's a construct, we call it, which means we can't prove it's there, but we like to believe it is. Needless to say, though, I think a lot of folks with Parkinson's would agree with me that they have more difficulty thinking about their own thoughts. And that's a very, very intensive process. When you're thinking about your own thoughts, you're actually sort of dividing your attention and your mind to do another task. And that takes a lot of energy. And anybody with Parkinson's can tell you, energy is one thing you don't have in great volume. So you've got to monitor what's going on inside you. The more traditional definitions are what we do is we take pieces of cognitive function and we talk about them being sort of guided by executive function. Now, there is no little person sitting in our head running the pilot house and making us do things. Metacognition kind of applies to, implies that, but there's no little somebody up there running this thing for us. So we cut it down. We have to look at different processes that go on. One of the things you have to do to interact with the world is you have to attend to the world. You have to get information in some manner, either through your ears, through your eyes. Less common would be tactily, smelling. But somehow you've got to get information into your eye, into your brain, and then you have to orient to it. So you have to be able to devote a certain amount of attention to be able to perform any kind of a task. Now, what we find with Parkinson's disease is that people have a very difficult time with sustained attention, or vigilance is another way we could do it. They have a hard time focusing on a task for a long period of time. I joke with some of the people that I work with, but it's almost as if there's an acquired attention deficit disorder. And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but when I give a test of sustained attention that is typically given to students that have attention deficit disorder, what I find is people who are able to respond, they don't have the motor part of it isn't really slow, but their ability to just keep that focus going over the course of a very long, boring test. If you are ever going to a neuropsychologist, the best way to study for that test is to watch a puddle dry. So I put people in and have them do this, and what I find is invariably folks with Parkinson's disease have some difficulty with vigilance, and there are different areas where that happens. That's the reason I give the test. I can get a more sort of a segmented idea of what's going on, but paying attention is not a strong suit for a lot of folks with Parkinson's. So if you've got Parkinson's, listen up. The next part of this, you get the information in, you're temporarily storing it. There's a lot of theories about what's going on there, but you put it in some little temporary place to hold it. If you want to use a computer as an example, the random access memory in a computer is there. You type something in a computer, you turn it off, and if you didn't save it, it's gone. That's to some degree what's happening with attention. So it disappears very quickly unless you do something else with it. That's where we talk about something called working memory. And again, this is a very purposeful kind of a process that goes on that's related to executive function. You've got to process the information and do something with it. You've got to decide if it's important, first of all. If it's not important, you kick it out and wait for the next thing. But if it's important and something you're going to need to do, you're going to move it on to another place where you're going to store it. If I give you my telephone number right now and ask you to memorize my telephone number, what are you going to do? You're going to hear it, you're going to rehearse it a couple of times, and then you're going to get it. That's your working memory in action. So this is another process that is sort of guided by the metacognitive aspects of cognitive function. They're sort of the gateway to executive dysfunction because they're controlling the information flow. They're amenable to some degree of cognitive rehabilitation. There are brain programs like one of the ones that I use is called CogMed. This is the simplest way to work on working memory. I can take a deck of cards and we can have more fun working on your working memory with a deck of cards because I have a lot of little procedures that I do that involve watching the cards and remembering a certain number of cards back what you saw. So you have to hold information in place. But a lot of times when I'm working with people to try and improve their working memory, it's a card game. And I always win. Yeah, it's a rigged deck. Yeah, I rigged the deck before I get in there. Okay, so we're talking about attention and working memory. We've got to get the information in. Let's talk now a little bit about some of the other higher cognitive functions. They allow us to interact in the world with some degree of agency. When we go out in the world, if we're out on a street corner spouting off what we believe and nobody pays any attention to us, we don't have much agency. If we're able to interact with somebody and get them to listen to what we're saying, sounds a little like Congress, doesn't it? But these are some of the things that we have to do to be able to interact effectively with the world. One of the things we have to do is we have to be able to initiate and plan. One of the things that's really interesting, and I'll see this with a little more advanced Parkinson's, is people sometimes lose the ability to initiate behavior. It's not that they don't know how to do it, they just don't think to do it. And as you'll hear in our breakout session, that's one of the reasons why people with Parkinson's, if you're living with someone who has Parkinson's, it's handy to know some of this stuff because if you don't know that this is Parkinson's, you're going to think it's the person doing something, and that's going to lead to a lot of unnecessary friction. So being aware of this is the little pearl in here is when you're aware of these things, you can respond to it. The person who doesn't have Parkinson's can respond. So if you've got somebody that's sitting on the couch and you can't get the History Channel or ESPN off the television set, and you say, are you going to go cut the grass? Well, the person probably intends to cut the grass and would really like to cut the grass, but really isn't thinking about cutting the grass. So what do? Well, you raise the tempo a little bit, cut the grass. Now all of a sudden you're harping or you're doing all the things that you get accused of. But initiation problems, initiation and planning, it's just a case, or it's primarily a case of the person isn't thinking to do it. If you're not thinking about something, you're not going to do it. That's a higher order brain function. That's a monitoring your environment and monitoring your own thought processes to be able to do that. Very, very common in Parkinson's. The next is something that I've gotten more interested in because I'm finding it more and more to be an element of Parkinson's disease that, first of all, there have been some neuropsychological studies that have indicated that this is important. It's called prospective memory. It's the memory to remember, or remembering to remember. Where does this come in play? Well, you got to take your medication. You're not using a timer, you're not doing anything. At 3 o'clock, you're going to take your medication. You got to remember at 3 o'clock to take the medication. And as a lot of people know, without that timer or pill box, nothing happens. So the memory to remember something gets impaired with Parkinson's very commonly. Now, it's interesting because I was just having a conversation about this a few minutes ago, but prospective memory is actually kind of what we're talking about when we say people get forgetful. That's when you tell somebody, why don't you go down to the grocery store and get this, this, and this later on, and that person says, sure, and then they don't remember to remember. That's what we kind of talk about forgetfulness. That is the single thing that puts more people in my office across the chair with somebody saying, Dr. Short, her memory's no good, because this person is not remembering to remember. There's a substantial executive function piece in here because you've got to lay down a marker and you've got to be able to go back to that marker and say, okay, now I'm going to do this thing at so-and-so. So there's some deficits in there for some folks with Parkinson's. Mental flexibility is another area. If you have someone who has Parkinson's and just seems like they get stuck on an idea, and you'll shift the attention away and the person is stuck on the idea and comes back to it. That's a kind of a problem with mental flexibility. The other place you'd see it is if a person has to alternate strategies doing something. One of the tests, or several of the tests that I use, require you to do two separate things, but you have to be monitoring them and altering them. So the mental flexibility is what a lot of folks see when you've got someone who is not, it just kind of gets stuck. And a lot of folks will come into my office, I just can't get that person to leave this go. So this will be the person that might be spending, hours looking for a single piece of paper in a stack of papers. And not finding it and getting distressed about it. Another executive function is inhibition. Now, inhibition's an interesting thing. It's not as big a problem with Parkinson's early on. It tends to come more in advanced stage Parkinson's. But it does occur for some people. And I do check for it, but I don't see it a great deal. The other place where we have some problems is rapid strategizing. This again goes in with that bradyphrenia. I say bradykinesia, I'm wrong. Bradyphrenia, the slowed thinking. Folks with Parkinson's find it a little more difficult to rapidly shift and think about different things, different strategies. What you'll notice a lot of times is a person can't drop, and again, this goes back to mental flexibility, but a person has a hard time dropping something to do something else that's important. And so it's difficult for them to rapidly strategize new behaviors. Let me read over here, so I'm looking at this side. The higher cognitive functions allow us to interact with the world with, my proofreader didn't catch me on that. She caught me on a really interesting slide I wrote. I used some placeholder things that I can search for. I just happened that day to be in an ibble-dibble kind of mood. So I had a slide that said ibble-dibble that you guys almost got to see. I mentioned that you probably didn't want to get anything about executive function from a demented psychologist, so it was good that she caught me. Okay. Let's see. Did I go too far here? Whoop. There we go. Okay. One of the first places people see problems with Parkinson's disease is in the workplace. When I go back and I get a history, a lot of times what I'll hear a person say is, my 8-hour day became 12 hours. I couldn't finish doing everything. And it wasn't just the slowing that was causing it, because a person would say, I sat there with everything in front of me. I was talking to a guy that was doing income taxes a couple weeks ago. He said, I have everything laid out in nice little neat piles. And I look at those piles and I cannot for the life of me figure out what to do with them. I don't know where to start. and it takes me longer to go through this process. So a lot of times when I'm doing a good history on people, the first noticeable evidence of Parkinson's for a lot of folks is it takes me a lot longer to do my job at work, which now feeds into some of the ideas for accommodation and employment. This is a bona fide problem for a lot of people. How do we respond to it in the workplace? But that is actually somewhat of an executive function problem, because you have to choose. First of all, you have to say, what's important for me to do today? If it's not on my to-do list, how do I organize it? What's first, what's second? And for a person with Parkinson's, a lot of times all those things look the same. There's one that doesn't jump, nothing jumps out. So it's hard to decide, where do I start? What am I doing here? Very, very common early in Parkinson's. Folks with Parkinson's sometimes, it's easier to read this one. Folks with Parkinson's sometimes have fewer spontaneous actions that suggest what's going on inside them. So this is also an executive function problem to some degree. I'm going to talk about it in a little bit. But as the Parkinson's disease starts to cut into the social signaling that goes on, as we get masking, as we get a drop in spontaneous movements, it becomes harder to figure out what's going on inside the person. That's our executive function at work, because we're trying to infer what's going on in that person. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, depending on, I haven't checked the time, but people with Parkinson's may actually have a little difficulty inferring what's going on in the other person. There have been some studies that have suggested that folks with Parkinson's might have a little difficulty figuring out, in rapidly changing emotional situations, folks with Parkinson's might be a little bit slow. And guess what the emotion is that folks with Parkinson's have a little bit of difficulty picking up on? Anger. So if you've got a rapidly changing, a rapidly escalating situation, an argument or a disagreement, and you're getting really perturbed, and the person with Parkinson's isn't picking up on that well, and also not emitting signals that you're able to pick up and say, okay, this person's getting it, well, we got a relationship problem. If you don't understand that to be Parkinson's related, you're going to think the other person's hard to get along with. And they're going to think you're hard to get along with, and you know how that is. So this is a significant relationship problem. This is something that we're going to talk about too in the breakout session, is how you deal with some of these things. The other thing that we're seeing with folks with Parkinson's is there's some evidence that people with Parkinson's are having a little difficulty with, it's more of a philosophical concept right now, theory of mind. Now, we've done experiments for many, many years about this concept of theory of mind. Essentially what it means is a person is able to infer that someone else is an autonomous being with a thought process. The way we tested this early on was with children, and just an example here, if I asked a child on the other side of the room what table 2, what did the people at table 2 look like, that child may not be able to infer what I'm seeing, because it doesn't, the child puts me in the same viewpoint as the child does. So when the child makes the inference about what's going on, the child tells me exactly what the child's seeing, but not what I'm seeing. About 4 or 5 years old, the child is able to differentiate and infer that, you know, mom and dad actually have a brain. Then they lose that again when they become teenagers, but that's another. So this idea of theory of mind has been around for a long time, and there have been actually, it's been about 6 studies done now. Not enough for us to really be able to say this is what's going on. We have to wait until. Neuropsychological studies are very difficult to do, because we get 5 people and we try to extrapolate that and say that applies to everybody with Parkinson's. Actually, with neuropsych experiments, what we have to do is we have to aggregate a whole lot of studies and do an analysis of the analyses. So this is still a kind of a hot topic right now, or a developing topic. But folks with Parkinson's may have a difficulty with theory of mind. So again, it's the ability to understand and predict other people's behaviors by attributing an independent state to them. There are actually two components to it. There's a feeling state, being able to infer a feeling state, and then there is a component about being able to actively process information about what the other person might be experiencing. Well, the studies seem to point out, in a really kind of a mild review here, theory of mind may be impaired in very early Parkinson's. That this may actually be one area of cognition that is changing very early in the process of Parkinson's. And so it becomes a little more difficult for a person with Parkinson's to engage in that idea of what's going on in the other person. Doesn't mean they can't do it, it just means that it becomes more of a challenge. Now, as with all these other things I've talked about, where this is a huge problem is when you have a rapidly escalating or rapidly changing circumstance. Because if the person's having a hard time figuring out what's going on, what you're thinking, you're going to have some discord. Now, being able to infer how people feel is generally intact early in Parkinson's, but we see it disappear in later Parkinson's. And that's consistent with what I was saying, that people with Parkinson's sometimes have a hard time figuring out what the heck's going on in the other person. So we're thinking that at least some of the early studies are indicating that this may be an area that gets impaired very quickly in Parkinson's, that there's going to be just a decrement in it. Now, what that means in the real world, we have no idea. We can get a scientific finding, it's going to be statistically significant, it's got no relevance to the outside world. But these studies seem to be pointing to the idea that there is an impairment in theory of mind. So persons with Parkinson's sometimes have a hard time making social judgments. All right, meeting the cognitive challenges. If you go to Medicare and you say, I want to get some cognitive rehabilitation, I'm having some difficulty with my memory, I'm having some executive dysfunction, good luck. It's not going to be covered. It's not going to be covered because you have a chronic progressive neurological disorder. If you had a stroke, if you were in a car accident, if you had a tumor, if you had any of a number of things that somebody could say, aha, that's just a point in time and we might be able to correct it, you would be able to get cognitive rehabilitation. It's very difficult to find folks that work with cognitive rehabilitation with Parkinson's because it's a chronic progressive disorder and you're not going to find insurance companies that are going to pay for that. Just briefly, an overview of some of the things that we would do. Managing executive function challenges, a lot of the work that I do comes out of work I did with attention deficit disorder, primarily with adults actually. A lot of the problems look a great deal like what you see with ADD. So we come up with strategies like, lists, and more lists, but also prioritizing things and taking cards and sorting, physically sorting so that you can decide how you want to do something. My playing cards too. We have to recognize that this is another aspect of PD and it's not purposeful behavior. So a lot of times cognitive rehabilitation includes that work I've talked about where you have to go to spouse and family and say, look, he's not doing this because this is a willful thing that's going on. These are cognitive changes that are occurring and we need to adjust to them. So one of the strategies for managing the executive challenges is to make other people aware they exist, and then we can work on a comprehensive strategy and we can go play at home. So the idea with a lot of cognitive rehabilitation with Parkinson's disease is we want to teach you how to do this and have you go home and practice it. The only problem is people with Parkinson's have a difficult time initiating. So cognitive rehabilitation becomes like speech therapy and physical therapy. You do real well while you're being trained, and then you go home and, well, yeah, there's the History Channel and ESPN again. The other thing we have to look at is communication and feedback. It's real important for us to get a lot of feedback to families, but also to the person with Parkinson's, because there is some benefit to dealing with the executive function changes. I actually am going to do a plug in just a minute. VCU is doing a study on cognitive rehabilitation for what's we call mild cognitive impairment, which means it doesn't rate as dementia. So it's exactly what I'm talking about. And they're actively recruiting people to engage in some cognitive rehabilitation exercises. So you folks do have an opportunity maybe to contribute to the literature at some point down the line. But as I understand it, there's some preliminary evidence that folks benefit very much from this. So part of the problem is Medicare and your insurance company doesn't think you can change. But my experience, and I think the experience borne out in a study, is that you folks actually can change. We're never going to get a person back to where they were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I carried a comb in my pocket. Then one day I realized that that was kind of a senseless thing to do. So we're never going to go back to the old days. But we can improve our function and live as optimally as I can. So this again is getting into this idea of optimal living. If there's something that we can work with to help you improve your function in the world, you know, we need to look into doing this. So I guess this is another stump to say, you know, go shake down your Congress people and all the funding agencies and say, why don't you fund some cognitive rehabilitation studies, particularly at, you know, do some more at VCU, so they can hire me and I can live in Richmond. This is part of living well with Parkinson's. To understand the cognitive aspects of it, to understand, now there's a whole literature on dementia. It's real easy to find help for dementia among most of these conferences because the assumption is that Parkinson's is going to lead to dementia. Not true. It can lead to dementia. There's a specific kind of dementia that tends to occur. By the way, how many caregivers do I have here? Okay, you guys all failed my test. You're not caregivers. If you are a spouse, you made a promise many years ago that in sickness and health you were going to be there. Now, they catch us when we're young and dumb. We never think that's going to get invoked. Then suddenly that clause gets evoked. If you are living with a person with Parkinson's and you are helping that person with their Parkinson's, you are not a caregiver. You're a loving family member, you're a spouse, you are a good friend, whomever the person who is assisting a person with Parkinson's is. Use that term, and the burden isn't quite the same as it is when you're a caregiver, because caregiver is a job. I'm a caregiver. I can guarantee you, I don't know what the going rate is for caregiving out in the Parkinson's community. What are you guys getting paid? It's marginally better if you're a caregiver of my size. I'm a caregiver. Nurses and doctors are caregivers, but during the day-to-day function that everybody's going through, you are a family member, a loving family member, and you are part of the Parkinson's team. If you forget that you're part of the Parkinson's team, the system doesn't work as effectively. So again, one of the things that I like to do is I like to make sure that folks with, that family members are as knowledgeable as they can be about some of these things that come up, because it makes the job a lot easier. In fact, it isn't a job, it's just learning how to communicate better. So maybe we'll see some of you folks in the next session, and thank you for staying awake for 50 minutes.